I'd like to start our time together with a few introductory remarks. And as many times as I think about these things, as many times as Jeff and I have discussed these matters, or we've given talks like this, I always start the same way. I want to start just by telling you a story about the first time I saw somebody die. So I'm a physician. You'll learn more about me as time goes on this evening. But the first time you see somebody die, it was unlike anything I'd ever anticipated. There were smells, there were sounds. I was a budding medical, wasn't even in medical school at that point. I was doing some volunteer work in a local emergency room. And an ambulance brought in an elderly man who was in a code. Okay, so that part of the movie is true. There's a code, and you got to do all these things to save the life. They bring the man in on a stretcher. And the paramedics are pushing on his chest, and they're hooking leads up, and they're starting lines, and they're pushing medications, and there's all these things that are happening simultaneously. And there comes a moment in a code situation when the attending physician will always say the same thing. We always say the same thing. I don't know if they capture this in the movies. The attending physician will always say, "Go get the family." And what that means is stop your interventions. Make this individual presentable, because their family is about to come through the drapes and receive the worst news that some of them have ever received. And I remember in that moment experiencing that and thinking to myself, death in that situation, an elderly man, he'd lived his life. He lived his life. He had children, they were grown, they were older than me. He had grandchildren. He was a successful businessman. He had a life, and he ended it, and it was over, and it made sense to me. And as I've progressed in medicine, I remember reflecting on that and thinking, death is natural, suffering is natural, this makes sense. And then I became a pediatric resident and a pediatric subspecialist, and I remember the time I saw the first child die. Middle of the night, code situation, emergency personnel brings a child in from a small town in rural Iowa, a traffic accident. They bring the child into the ICU. I'm the resident on call. We're starting lines. We're pushing things. Everything sounds the same. Everything sounds the same. Except the spot where the attending physician says somebody's got to go and get the family. Because when that was spoken, the first time I'd heard it, I didn't have a problem with it. It just made sense. But in this situation, I was confronted with the very real problem of pain and suffering in the context that didn't make sense to me when I considered it from a natural perspective. There is nothing natural about a child who dies. When you asked to go and get the family, there was this exhale that came at the end of that sentence that I remember thinking, this cannot possibly be happening. And we go and bring the family in, and you watch them stand around the bed, and you watch them sob. You watch them leave the hospital and look in the rearview mirror of their car and see an empty car seat where their child once sat. They drive home. They park their car in the garage. The light in the room where the child once slept is still on. The shoes that the child did not pick up and put away at the end of the day of school were still there. There's nothing natural about suffering and pain. In certain contexts, it makes no sense. And it was in that moment that I realized that I must, as a physician, as a person who espouses a Christian worldview, I must turn and face the cold, hard steel barrel of the truth that we live in a world where really, really bad things happen. So what should the response be? I'll tell you what it's not going to be. So often when we think about pain and suffering, and we think about the biblical world, when we think about individuals who identify themselves as Christians, so often do they come bearing nothing more than the gift of fairy dust. There's this great lyric in one of my favorite songs, and it says, "Are we all dangerous? Lost boys showing up, pockets full of fairy dust." I'm not here tonight to offer you a sprinkle of fairy dust. I'm not going to give you a biblical platitude. I'm not going to give you something that fits on a bumper sticker or a bracelet that's going to make you feel warm and fuzzy, because if you have lived the life that I know you have drank deep of the cup of suffering that makes no sense. And if you have not, you will. And my question, the reason we're here is, what are you going to do in that moment? Sitzim Lieben. My claim to fame in ministry was I started when I became a physician, I started seminary. I thought, well, why not? I mean, let's just keep adding to the student debt. So I entered seminary, and the only thing I remember from seminary before I quit was Sitzim Leben, which is a German phrase that says, basically what it means is you have to understand the narrative context of the scripture. And I want to extend that. You have to understand the narrative context of the story. When we think about the Bible, when we think about the biblical worldview, so much of why it feels like fairy dust in a world where tsunamis hit shores and kill 230,000 people, in a world where very small pine boxes bury very small children who lived beautiful lives and died horrible deaths. The reason why fairy dust won't do it, the reason why the Bible has a place that in our culture and deserves to have the dust blown off of it from the attic of culture and brought into our everyday world is because it actually has value. The Bible, the Sitzim Leben, the biblical worldview, came from a place of nothing short of travesty, destruction, chaos, sorrow, shame, guilt, hopelessness. This is the narrative context of the biblical truth that I'm here to espouse to you tonight. The things that I'm here to tell you don't come from fairy dust in Christian radio stations. They come from a very real people group who experienced a very radical transformation in a very dark time. So what I want to do tonight is very simple. I want to share with you what I found helpful. I want to share with you candidly and openly what I have found helpful when I'm in dealing with individuals who are struggling greatly. I'm offering you a free chance at gold. Because again, as I've said, if you haven't experienced these things in your life, you will. And I pray that you listen and that you soak in the words that we're going to share with you tonight. But I want to share with you what I found helpful. I want to spend our time talking to you about the philosophical approach to evil and suffering. I want you to understand how the philosophical approach to evil and suffering and its extended logic in that it somehow disproves the presence of a good and loving God falls apart. It is full of holes. And in the moment where you need it most, in the moment when you're standing by the grave, in the moment when someone gets the family, it will not help you. And I know that. I know that because as a physician, I have been in those places so many times. And I want to share with you tonight what I say and what people need most to hear in that moment. I want to share with you not only the philosophical, but I want to talk to you about the personal problem of evil. Because if you folks are anything like me, there's a head part to this and there's a hard part to this. And the hard part is where we feel it most. We can analyze and we can philosophize and we can come to understandings, but at the end of the day, we still hurt. We're still angry. We're still sad because you're human beings and you have air in your lungs. I want to talk to you about the personal approach to evil and suffering. I want to demonstrate to you that evil and suffering does not disprove the existence of God. More so, the existence of evil and suffering for me in my faith, and as I share with you, it demonstrates, it supports a belief in a good and loving God. What I don't want to do is provide you with simple answers. I don't want to minimize the pain and suffering that you've experienced in your life. And I promise you, I won't be a jerk. You are a believer, yes, but you skip the not being a jerk about it part. I won't be a jerk, I promise. Two paths to deal with tonight. The philosophical problem of evil and suffering, which consists of the logical and the probable. We're going to talk about both of those. And then lastly, we're going to close our time together talking about the very real, personal problem of evil and suffering and the issues that it presents to faith. Let's begin with the logical problem. Now, the logical problem of evil and suffering is as old can be. Okay? On the left is Epicurus, a Greek philosopher. Okay? He was the first, historically, to come up with this concept that we're going to talk about in a minute. On the right is David Hume, a Scottish philosopher from the 1700s who wrote a book, and I got to make sure I get this right, called The Dialogues Concerning Natural Religion. And they both basically say the exact same thing. I want to summarize it for you now. tell me, in your mind, if you've ever heard this. They both say this. God may be all-powerful, but not all-loving. God may be all-loving, but not all-powerful. They both believe that God, as he's represented in the Bible, cannot be both, because these are mutually exclusive, logically inconsistent statements. How is it possible that a good and loving, all-powerful God can exist, and yet tsunamis destroy countries, and economies fall apart, and suffering and tragedy happen every single minute of every single day? How on earth can we rectify those two things? So they come to the conclusion that there can be no possible way the God of the Bible exists. Now, this argument was not just in the time of the Greek philosophers, and not just in a very old book written by a philosopher from Scotland. It's not just then, it is absolutely now. In 2004, the Great Tsunami hits. 230,000 people, as we've said, lost their lives almost instantaneously, or so it felt and seemed at the time. The Pacific Rim experiences an absolute tragedy. Nearly 250,000 people are gone. And Ron Rosenblum, a writer for the New York Observer, writes this: if God is God, he is not good. If God is good, he is not God. You cannot have it both ways, especially after the Indian Ocean catastrophe. It's a version of a challenging syllogism posed by philosopher J.L. Mackie that has not been refuted in the time that it's been written. It has never been overturned. What is he saying? He's saying the exact same thing that these two guys said. He's espousing the fact that the logical problem of evil simply states this: the existence of an all-powerful, all-loving God and the existence of suffering are logically inconsistent. They cannot go together, therefore there is no God of the Bible. So the question that we need to address, if we're going to quickly dispense of the logical problem of evil and suffering, is this true? Are these actually mutually exclusive, logically inconsistent statements? And the answer is no. No. Let me explain it to you. So, this is a summary slide. God plus suffering equals contradiction. Okay? So that's the statement that they're making. But what we have to understand is the nature of an explicit contradiction. Okay, I'm going to give you an example. An explicit contradiction is an obvious one. Okay, and I'm going to give you an example. And I want you to understand that there's no explicit or obvious contradiction between a good and powerful God and a world with evil and suffering. But first, let me define the contradiction. This man, beautiful, yes. Rapturous, yeah, I agree, all those things. But I'm going to give you an example of an explicit contradiction. As gorgeous as this man is, this man cannot be bald and have hair at the same time. Do you understand? Jeff Johnson is not bald and has a glorious mane of hair that he combs every night, 100 combs. He cannot be both. Those statements would be examples of mutually inconsistent, logically inconsistent, and explicitly contradictory to one another. Okay? Another example, you can't be married and a bachelor. Okay? So as we think about the question of explicit contradictions, an all-good, all-powerful, all-loving God, and evil and suffering in the world, what we know without a doubt is that when we look at those two statements, there is no obvious, explicit contradictions between the two. But there still must be contradictions hidden somewhere. If an all-powerful, all-loving God exists, suffering does not exist. We know there's not an explicit contradiction, but there are implied or implicit contradictions within this that individuals who espouse the logical worldview of evil and suffering as it dispenses of a belief in God. There are two things that you don't hear in these statements. The first of which is this. This is your implicit, this isn't your first implied statement that is not stated outright. Okay, and it reads like this: all-powerful God, an all-powerful God can create any world that he wants. Okay, that's our implicit contradiction. That's what's been implied, that's what's been assumed in making this argument work. Let's talk about that. So, an all-powerful God the assumption is this: an all-powerful God can create whatever world he wants. Now, this is probably the greatest boy band of all time. Okay, you guys can think what you want to think, but just know that you're absolutely wrong. Okay, this, my friends, is NSYNC. There's not One Direction or the next band that's going to be after One Direction. This is where it all started. Okay, now this is their 2000 second release album called No Strings Attached. Now, please understand this. The essence of what I'm trying to show you here is that in order for the statement that God can create any world he wants, you must understand the fact that that is inherently untrue because of the simple fact of free will. The whole idea here is that these guys, the whole album idea was we're puppets being pulled by strings. So in essence, puppets are not free. So, is the statement that a God can create any world he wants true if he chooses to create beings that have free will? I, Nate Noble, have free will. Jeff Johnson has free will. You are free to do what you want. You are free to run from God, and you are free to embrace God. That is the essence of love. Love. In my marriage to my beautiful bride, I don't control her. She freely chooses me, and I freely choose her back. And that is what the basis of a loving relationship is. So, can a God create a world where no suffering exists if he also wants us to have the free will to make our own choices? No. He has to choose one or the other. Could there be possibly a world somewhere in some infinite universe where nothing bad happens? Yes. But would that be a world where individuals can be free? No. No. So it is not, these contradictions quickly fall apart. Look at the face of Pinocchio when he realizes that there are no strings on me. We are free. One of the greatest gifts of the Christian worldview that I can think of is the freedom that I can have to set up this place with my friend Jeff Johnson and invite you to come and have a very candid discussion in the hopes of removing even one small roadblock, one small piece of shrapnel that's stuck in the soul of someone who has been wounded by something that has happened to them, and they've held on to it and it's festered and they've allowed it to grow and convince themselves in some distant way that the God of the universe doesn't love them, isn't real, isn't good, isn't powerful, all because they believe the logical problem of evil is real. It's not. So the assumption number one that can make this argument work is a God, if it's all powerful, can create any world he wants, and the answer to that is no. He can't. He cannot. Let's look at the second assumption. An all-powerful God, an all-loving God, would prefer a world without suffering, which is this. The second assumption, in order to make the logical problem of evil work, in order to believe in your mind from a deductive standpoint that the God of the universe, the all-powerful God, who's all-powerful and all-loving, allows evil and suffering, and those are mutually incompatible. The way that that works is you have to believe these two things. An all-powerful God can create any world he wants. We've shown you that that is not true. The second assumption that you must dispel to understand that this is not an effective strategy is to understand that an all-loving God prefers a world without suffering. Now listen, that makes sense. Now that makes sense, but let me ask you this. How could we ever really know? Let's say for just a minute that the God of the universe that hung the stars and created us, let's say just for a minute that he potentially has reasons for suffering. Why would we know them? How could we possibly prove that an all-loving God prefers a world without suffering when we all can think of times in our lives when suffering brought us to a very low place for a moment, but then as we reflect back on that through the rear view mirror of life, we realize that in that suffering, good things came. Do you know what the best kind of soil is? My dad's a farmer. The best kind of soil is made of two things. It's made of ashes and feces. So you want beautiful things to grow from life? So many beautiful things I can point to in my own life have grown from the fertile soil of things that have been burned to the ground. And feces, excrement. From those things grow the most beautiful things we can imagine in our lives. Now, that's not always true. And I'm not meaning to say that every bad thing is going to come full circle in our lives. But what I'm saying is I don't need to, in order to disprove the logical problem of evil, the burden is not on me to prove that every bad thing comes around for good. It's for the individual who believes this worldview. The burden of proof is not on me. It's on them to prove two things. Number one, it is logically impossible that free will exists. Someone, in order to believe this worldview, would actually have to logically prove to me that free will does not exist. Number two, they have to prove, logically impossible, that God has reasons for permitting suffering. They'd have to prove that it is logically impossible for God to have reasons to allow suffering to be permitted in this world. And as you can understand, you can guess, those things are not going to happen. So the logical problem of evil and suffering that's been espoused by David Hume and Epicurus and still finds its way into popular culture every time a tragedy hits is built on sand. It is full of holes, and it will not help you. It will not help you when things fall apart. Which leads us to our second problem. As I mentioned, in order to deal with the philosophical problem of evil and suffering and to prove to us, to prove to you that it does not disprove the presence of an all-powerful, all-loving God, we must first dispel with the logical problem of evil, which we just did. And you have to understand that this isn't just me saying this. It is widely understood in broader philosophical circles that the logical problem of evil and suffering is done. It's over. On almost all sides. So the burden of proof, as I've said, is that the person who says this is wrong must prove that it's impossible that free will exists and it's impossible that God has reasons for permitting suffering. And as you can see, that's the worst idea ever. So now let's talk about the second question. I'll end this part with a quote. We can concede that the problem of evil does not, after all, show that the central doctrines of theism are logically inconsistent with one another. Nice summary statement, which we'll visit that author again in a minute. Okay, let's go on to the second problem, the probability problem of evil. Now listen, let me read this. I should have made one of those nobody can depict me rules, says Buddha. They always make me fat. And then Jesus says, tell me about it. I've been a blonde white dude for like 2,000 years. What is the probability that Jesus was a blonde white dude? Pretty low, right? Well, let's just go with 0. I'm going to go with 0, okay? He came from the Middle East. He was of Jewish descent. We know that the Bible depicts him or describes him as a man who was likely unnoticed, right? He wasn't tall, he wasn't muscular, he didn't have good nails, and he didn't have hair product. He was unrecognizable. He would not have wowed an audience at all. That's about all we know about Jesus. The probability that he is anything like any of the people that we see depict him in movies is 0, okay? But the probability problem of evil and suffering is very, very potent and very important. And we need to spend the next maybe 5-10 minutes talking about this specific version. Because what has now happened is individuals have taken the logical problem of evil and they've put it on the shelf. So we're done with that now. They know that's where it goes. It's broken. It's not going to be useful in the secular world. It's not going to be useful in the academic sphere. Okay, it's going to be, you're taking a knife to a gunfight. Okay, but let's talk about even a more potent but yet subtle approach to the attempt to disprove that an all-powerful, all-loving God cannot coexist in the context of a world full of evil and suffering. It's called the probability argument, and it basically says this. It says that it is logically possible that God and suffering can exist. It's logically possible. Okay, we fine. The logical argument, we believe it, fine. It's logically possible that God can be all powerful and all good and coexist with evil. But, noble, here's the but it's unlikely. It is very unlikely. It's possible that an obese man with a beard carries gifts down a chimney every year and gives them to kids that don't deserve it. It's possible, but it seems unlikely, Noble, right? It's possible, but it seems like it might be a stretch, okay? Essentially equating the idea of an existence of God to something similar to Santa Claus, okay? Possible, unlikely, all right? And the reason that this is gained traction is because of one simple statement. And the reason that this gains traction is because it's improbable, unlikely because of this simple statement, because there's too much pointless suffering in the world. There's just too much pointless suffering in the world. So it's very improbable that God exists in the context of this evil world. So let's now talk again about, let's frame this up in its most recent form by J.L. Mackie, we just looked at a quote by him. This came from a book from 1982 called The Miracle of Theism. And what I want you to understand is that this is widely understood to be the last great attempt from an academic perspective to put forth this philosophical worldview to the academy. And the reason why it was the last great attempt to do this is because I'm about to show you it also doesn't work. In the book, J.L. Mackie makes these statements about the probability approach to evil and suffering. He says, if God exists, he would not allow pointless evil. Point B, because there is much pointless evil, the conclusion can be none other than God does not exist. I had my own blog for a while, but I decided to go back to just pointless, incessant barking. Pointless according to who? Hey, look. Pointless according to what? Do you see the subtlety in this statement? Basically, it's saying that because I don't understand the point of this suffering, because I can't comprehend the point of this suffering, there is no point. Because let's face it, I am the end-all, be-all of knowledge, and I should be able to understand all things. Okay? So after college, I moved home. After college, I moved home. And maybe some of you will experience this. I moved home, and I hadn't gotten into medical school yet, and I wasn't sure what I was going to do with my life. And I remember I was carrying siding, and I was working with my dad, and he's a farmer in Northwest Iowa. And I remember just being at the lowest point that I could remember at that point in time. And my parents came around me, and they just were really worried about me. I was just really, really down. You have all these ideas about what you want to do and when you want to do it. And I came to this place where I was really, really down, and I had this idea. I said, look, medical school is maybe never going to happen, but I can play the guitar. So maybe what I'll do is I'll just go to a local church camp or whatever, and I'll just play the guitar, and maybe do some speaking, or I'll be in some skits. I don't know. Maybe they need a dude who can play guitar. So I call a camp. The camp turns out they do need a dude who needs the guitar, right? They hire me. Long story short, I meet my bride. I get into medical school. We have 4 beautiful kids, and it's 15 years, and I almost never take it off. Why? Because in that moment, as low as it was for me, and I know that is nothing. That is nothing compared to what many of you have walked through. I understand that. Nothing. But the point is still the same. Who says that suffering was pointless? Because in that specific situation, it led me to a place where my entire life was changed. Now, is that going to work for you the same way? I don't know. I'm not here to give you simple answers. I'm not here to put a bumper sticker to make it easy for us to get. I'm not trying to simplify this. But please know to be careful when you think about determining if something is pointless just because you don't see the end result of it. Pointless is not how I choose to see my suffering. Pointless is not how I choose to see the suffering of the kids who come to my clinic, whom I deliver the worst news ever. As a specialist, I work in clinical genetics and developmental behavioral pediatrics. So what that means is I see children with special health care needs all day. All day. They come to me from all over the state of Iowa, and I see these beautiful children, and their families have been waiting 9 months to a year for me to walk into a room and do an assessment, and for some, it's to tell them the worst thing they've ever heard. On average, we diagnose individuals with autism spectrum disorders 3, 4, 5 times a week, sometimes a day. And I've sat by so many families across, watching them weep. And in my mind and in my heart, I can promise you, I am not banking on this idea of pointless evil and suffering. Because from my perspective, to turn the lights on, to stand in front of you, to drive my car, to get to work, to love my kids, to do my job, I cannot breathe in and breathe out believing that pointless evil and suffering lives in this world. I refuse to see it through such a narrow, myopic lens. I don't know why it happens, but I refuse to concede that those families that cry and those children that struggle, it was all for naught. I do not believe in pointless evil. The probability problem, in summary, does not work for three big reasons. Number one, we are limited in our intelligence and perspective. I challenge you, lovingly, go into a room where somebody's writing complicated mathematical equations all over the wall, go up to the professor, who is it has to be your grading professor, that's part of their experiment, and you have to tap them on the shoulder and then say, this is pointless. And the reason it's pointless is because I don't understand it. Probably not an A in that class for you. Okay, probably not an A in that class. We are limited in our intelligence and our perspective. I can only see this far right now. I'm limited by this room. I don't know what's happening in my family. I don't know what's happening to my car right now. All I've got is what's in front of me. This is my perspective, and I'm limited in it. And not just from a visual standpoint. We are limited by our perspective in the way that we grew up, and in the religious experiences that we've had, and the way that we came to view the church, and the way that we came to think about God or the Almighty or the whatever. We all bring those things to the table. We have myopic lenses that we all put on, that we use to view the world. And my hope tonight is that you will understand that there's no such thing as pointless evil, and to take that off and trust in what you can't see. Because it turns out it's a lot. We're limited in our intelligence and perspective. But we're talking about a God who, from a biblical worldview, if that's something you choose to espouse, or at least to understand where I'm coming from, I believe in a God who sees all of history. He sees the beginning, he sees the end, he sees the middle, he's outside time. Do I know what that means? No. No idea what that means. Because I'm in time. It's like a fish understanding what it's like for me to not be in water. I have no idea what it means to be outside of time. But I don't need to. I know that because I'm limited, that doesn't mean that there's a pointless struggle. The Bible has a great story about this in the book of Job. If you're not familiar with the Bible, Job tells the story of the worst suffering ever that happened to, at that time, happened to the most righteous man on the planet. So in the Bible standards, this guy's getting like an A+ in morality. And God and Satan, far away from Job, have a discussion. And in the discussion, they come up with, Satan says, if I took everything away from him, from Job, that is, God, he won't love you anymore. So, and God says, fine, just don't kill him. So Satan proceeds in the next 41 chapters to take everything this guy has. He takes his family, he takes his riches, he takes his health. And we get to this spot, 41 chapters in, where this man is just surrounded by his friends that aren't really giving him very good advice. And he's just weeping in ashcloth, and he's just destroyed. And when God comes to meet him in that place, spoiler alert, he doesn't give Job a reason. This idea that we're entitled to some kind of reason for why tsunamis hit and why kids have autism and why one of my children might not make it into adulthood, this does not come from a Christian worldview. This does not come from a Christian worldview. Individuals who espouse the belief that an all-loving, all-powerful God can exist in the context of evil and suffering, people who believe that from a biblical worldview do not come at this believing that evil is pointless, and they do not come at it believing that they are entitled to an answer or an explanation. The Bible does not give us that option. So if Christians frustrate you because they seem like maniacs and crazy people, it's because we are. We have that much trust. Because I know that micromanaging and worrying and dotting my I's and crossing my T's isn't going to change anything. Tsunamis are still going to hit. Things are still going to go bad. But I can absolutely believe that at the end of the day, it's not pointless, and I am not entitled to an explanation. Alvin Plantinga says it best when we talk about the probability version of evil, when he talks about the no-see-em argument. Now, this is what he says. He says, do you look in the tent? He says, now listen, I camp. I'm a camper. I don't love do it much anymore, but I used to camp a lot. And when I bring my kids to go camping, what do they always do? They always leave the door to the tent, what? Open. They always leave it open. And the reason I want them to shut it is because bugs can get in there, right? And you guys, if you've ever been in Northern Iowa, I think it's still here too, but you know those little black bugs? Those ones that are like super small, but they bite and it's like your whole arm in flames and it feels like you got shot. I mean, it's horrible, right? You can't believe that little thing, does it? Well, Alvin Plantinga calls them no-see-ums. Okay? And basically what he says, the reason I want the tent door shut is because I don't want those bugs to get in there when I sleep and bite my face. So Alvin Plantinga tells a story like this. He says, listen, if we look at a tent, can we say with certainty, just from our view right here, that there are no no-see-ums in there? With absolute certainty. Can I say to you that there are no no-see-ums in there? No, because they're really small. But can I tell you if there's a St. Bernard in there? Is there a St. Bernard in there? No, because St. Bernards are big, and I would see it. And unless there's some magical mirror display happening, I would know if there is a giant St. Bernard in that tent. So my question is, when we think about the probability version of evil, why is it that when we look through the tent of life, when we open the door of life, why is it that we only expect to see St. Bernard explanations? Things that we can see, things that we can understand. When really, truly, we can't really speak to the fact if there are any little bugs in there. We don't really know, but we only look for the things that we can see. Is it possible that God is big enough, if he's big enough to be mad at, that he's big enough to know things about the world that you don't know? If God is big enough to be angry with because all these things are happening and he doesn't intervene, is it also possible to assume that he knows something you don't know? So friends, I want to submit to you as we begin 2 more points on the probability version of evil, and then we'll transition to the personal problem and we'll be done. I want to submit to you that this is looking very, very shaky. The second point that I'd like to submit to you as to why the probability version doesn't work is simply this. Relative to this full scope of evidence, when we think about the full scope of evidence, because what are we talking about right now? We're talking about evil and suffering. When all you focus on in your life, Jeff and I are just talking about like positive thoughts and reassuring yourself and just speaking a good word over yourself, and how that is scientifically proven to help boost your worldview, to boost your mood, to help you make better choices. It's a good thing to be in the practice of. So, is it possible that if we only focus on evil and suffering, that's all we'll see? But what if we expand our scope and we look at other pieces of information when we consider if God is real or not? We have to take more into account than just evil and suffering. Let me give you an example. So this is a probability table. Okay, now if you follow ESPN, like I do, you start the football game, right? You start the football game over here, and there's this probability of who's going to win, right? Now, this was the Super Bowl from last year. Okay, I have to get up here to show you this. So, it's the Super Bowl. It's pretty even, but we start out early, and people are thinking the Patriots all the way, right? So the game starts going, maybe first quarter, into the first quarter, okay? Then we get to the second quarter. Look what happens. You were all there. You remember. My buddy's at my house. He leaves my house. He leaves. I remember this. He left my house, and this is halftime, and the probability that the New England Patriots are going to win is as low as this table goes. And I said to him at this moment, with nachos on my breath, I said, you just watch. You're about to see the greatest comeback in history. I literally said that. I was like, that's it. And I didn't really care. I just like old guys who play football. I think it's awesome. I'm 40, so like, why not? I said, you just watch. You just watch. Well, according to the information that we had available to us at the time, I was a crazy person. According to the information that you have available to you at any given moment, Christians are judgmental jerks. They identify with one kind of political party, and they believe this and this about this, and they believe this about this contentious issue. If God is so good and so great, why about homeless guys? And let's talk about tuberculosis. And measles is still around. That sucks. If that's all you came to consider, then you're stuck at halftime of last year's Super Bowl. You left my house. You made a mistake. Because it turns out I was right. Third quarter starts, still pretty low. Still not giving Tom Brady a whole lot of credit. But something happens at the end of regulation. And then what happens? Overtime, score, game. Probably the greatest game I'll ever see in my entire life. Ever. So I want to submit to you that when we look at the problem we're discussing and we expand our view, it becomes increasingly probable that a good and loving God can exist when we begin to think about things aside from evil and suffering and contentious political issues and the things that are happening within our micro culture, our little micro moment. So many things that we fight over in this country. Do you think they're fighting over that in India? You think they're like going to fisticuffs in China or in Russia because some contentious thing about people taking a knee or not taking a knee? No, this is our small cultural moment. That's all that it is. But we take a broader perspective, a broader worldview, and we start to put other things in the probability table, things change for us. Puppies. Are you kidding me? Puppies? So evil and suffering, I just like puppies though. I like them. They're cute. They lick my face. Hey, what about babies that are dressed up like Santa? Who does not love that? I love that, Jeff. I'll have that come down my chimney every day. Little rascal. What about that? Who doesn't love dolphins? They make the sound, and they're not a fish, but I call them fish. They're not fish, Jeff. They're mammals, right? If they look like sharks, they're not sharks. What about shirts with wolves on them? You can't even tell me those aren't sweet. You guys got them, rid of them, and now you're like, oh man, I wish I would have kept it. It's awesome. And I bought it at Goodwill, and now you're out of luck. Okay? People who wear wolf shirts are awesome. You start thinking about that, or what about when you think about broader arguments about, hey, okay, so maybe there's no good loving God, okay, blah, 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 blah. Quick question, cosmological argument. How does something come from nothing? Okay, so particles, they're bouncing around, and the expansion theory, blah, 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 and all this thing. Just a quick question. How does something come from nothing? Unless there was a cause. And what do you do with that? Or what about the idea that from a historical perspective, there has never been any successful attempt to disprove the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ? It is a historical fact. When we expand our view, when we expand the probability table and have a few more nachos and wait till the fourth quarter, you begin to see that sometimes we allow this idea of a good and loving God to be disproven in our own minds through our myopic lens because all we put into the tank is anger and resentment and frustration, and that is justified in your life, and I understand that you struggle, and it's okay to be mad. We're going to talk about that next. I'm not saying don't be mad about what's happened to you. I'm saying don't let it keep you away from a God who's crazy about you. That's all I'm trying to say. These arguments just don't work. And lastly, I want you to understand that if you espouse a biblical worldview, or if you at least come to respect it or understand it, understand that Christians do not believe that the point of our life on this earth is happiness. We do not believe that God has made us to be pets, where we can just sit and do yoga and put cucumber slices on our eyes. When bad things happen to Christians, yes, we struggle, yes, we cry, yes, we get angry. So does my own son. Families fight. Families fight. They just do. I fight with my kids all the time. But at the end of the day, they always come back to me because they know who I am. The anger, the resentment, the frustration, the things that have happened to us in our lives, the tsunamis, the death, the divorce, the breakup, the way that you were treated when you were a child, we can't take those things away. But what we can do is break down the mild, small wall that exists between you and a God who wants nothing more than to be together with you. It doesn't mean that he's going to take all those experiences away, but it does mean that they weren't pointless. When we think about Christian doctrine, you have to understand that our goal is not to be comfortable pets. That's not what Christianity offers. We absolutely believe that mankind is in rebellion, that my kids don't listen to me and bad things happen when they don't. That's what happens at my house. And that's the same thing that happened in our relationship with God. We rebelled. We chose in our free will to go a different way. We're going to choose our own way. We're going to eat the apple and tell you to shove off God. And then sin enters the world, and with sin comes death. And with death comes tsunamis. And with death comes cancer and autism and divorce and strife and war and shame and guilt. That's what came with sin. God is not delivering this to us and saying, here you go, you guys, you need a shot of badness to shape up or stop acting bad. That's not what's happening. It's not what a good dad does. But it does allow us to reap the consequences of our decisions. purpose of life is not to be happy pets. I like to transition at this point with a brief slide, and then I want to end our time together with the personal problem, with the personal problem of evil and suffering. Okay, this is the place where we deal with how it feels, what it tastes like, the salt in your mouth from getting punched in the face by life. That's what we're going to close our time with, because that, to me, is by far the most important thing to discuss with you. God whispers to us in our pleasures. He speaks in our consciousness, but shouts in our pains. It is his megaphone to rouse a deaf world. I liken it to smelling salts. Okay? If everything went the way I wanted it to go, what kind of person would I be? Would I have grit? Would I be here? Would I be a good friend or a good father or a faithful servant, or would I be kind? If I'd never been on the other side of the tracks, how would I know what this side should be like? Please understand that both the logical and the probable problems that attempt to disprove the existence of God in the context of evil fail. They fail miserably. They fail all the time. They fail in every context. So please hear me carefully, and I mean this in a respectful manner. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. But let's get back to it. As we close our time together, let's talk about fairy dust again. My sons and I have a secret handshake that we do. So we made it up the other day. So we come in like this. Okay, you can't steal this. This is mine. Get come with your own. Come in like this, right? Then the thumbs go up like that, right? And then we pinch our thumbs down like this. Then we bring it back and we go like this. This is where we work up the fairy dust, right there. We sprinkle it into our hands, like that. And then I go, it's magical, I know. It's super magical, right? Listen. I want to talk to you as we close our time today about the personal problem of pain. And I want to come back to this idea of fairy dust, because that is not going to help us. These philosophical worldviews, these things I've discussed, the logical, right, the probabilistic versions of evil and suffering, these are not going to help you. They are not going to give you a warm blanket on a cold day. They're not going to shield you from the storms of life. The cold, hard barrel of steel that's bearing between your shoulder blades, that is both the pain and suffering that we are to experience and the beautiful potential that God has for us in this life, we must face, and we must face it daily. So what will we do? Will we rely on philosophical worldviews? Will we fight our way through life with our brain, thinking we'll just put things in categories and on shelves and then somehow that will make it hurt less? But those things don't help you when you're weeping by a pine box. They will not help you when you stare at an empty car seat or when you go get the family. They're worthless to you then. So why? You agree with me that the logical problem's bunk, the probabilistic problem's bunk, but many people, when they get to this place, they're still not ready. They still don't want to hear about a good, loving God. They still don't care. So why is that in the lives of people? I'd submit to you there's three things going on in the hearts of people. Maybe you, maybe me on some days, where we keep our arms distant even though we have no logical reason to do it. I think there's three ways. There's three things I want to talk to you about. You're still mad. You're still mad. You're saying, this isn't fair. Yeah, fine, logical, blah, 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 blah. I'm still mad, though. Like what happened to me when I was a kid, Noble, that's not okay. What happened to my sister, what happened to my mom, that's not okay. I'm still mad. And I want you to know that that's fine. That's good. Because I'm mad too. Second thing is, you're saying this isn't fair. Yeah, okay, fine, publicity, blah, 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 blah. That's fine. What do you know, Noble? Because this isn't fair. Because you know why? This happened to me. It didn't happen to you. It didn't happen to that guy. It didn't happen to these people over here. It didn't happen to my neighbor who maybe deserved to have something bad happen to him. It happened to me. And this isn't fair. And lastly, you still hurt. You still hurt. Right? You still feel the sting. You still have a mouth full of salty blood. You still hurt. So let's start with mad. Listen, hey, you're mad, that's okay. I've already told you. Of course you don't need my permission, but listen, I want to validate that feeling. Being mad doesn't mean you're distant from God. All you have to do is read the Bible for 15 minutes, Psalms, Proverbs, doesn't matter. You're going to find plenty of people who are mad at God. Very mad. Okay? There's nothing wrong with being mad. Mad means relationship. Mad means that we're going to have a discussion. Mad means we're going to get to the bottom of something. I'm honest, you're honest, we're going to figure this out. Mad is okay, but listen to this. You have to pick the right thing to be mad at. Right? When you're married or if you're married, you understand that sometimes you get into arguments with your spouse, but really, who's the argument really about? It's about you. Right? It's not about that you didn't take out the garbage or you didn't do the thing you were going to do. It's because you feel slighted in some way. So you roar back at your spouse or your loved one or your family member or your friend, but really, they're the wrong target. Really, it's not them at all, is it? It's you. And you know it once you calm down, you think it through, and it's 2 weeks later, you had the right amount of coffee, and all of a sudden it's like, you know what, that was me, right? You have to, when you're angry, I understand, anger is not the question. The question is, who are you angry at? Because what have we said? In the Bible, it talks about, in Romans chapter 5, it said that man chose to sin, and sin entered the world, and death entered with sin. God is not going around offing kids. God is not going around abducting people into sex slavery. God is not going around slapping waves into the Pacific Rim and killing 250,000 people because he has nothing better to do. This is the result of a fallen world. This is the result of choices. If my son's bike gets stolen because he leaves it outside because he chose to, then he doesn't have a bike. If we choose to leave relationship with God and go our own ways, the Bible says, then we're left with a world that's full of death. Don't think that God is happy. God is not clean shaven. He doesn't look at you and say, treat you like a stepchild who just wants to beat you up and hate. He's not the God who just always reminds you of how bad you are and everything. That's not the situation at all. But irregardless of if you're angry, put your anger in the right place. God is not the one that caused this. We caused this. I'm not saying be mad at yourself, but be mad at sin. Sin. It's the thing, it's why people lie. It's why people cheat on their taxes. It's why all these rules that we have exist is because people will inherently sin. Why? Because they have free will. They can do it if they want to. But you're still mad, right? Pick the right target. The other thing I want to tell you about being mad is simply this. Some of you are mad because you think, well, God has all these resources. He has all this power. He has all this insight and wisdom, and yet he doesn't use it to my benefit. So, my children, they come to me in the middle of the day, right? Alia, who's 6, and she's a rascal. Well, she's 7 now. She's a rascal. She comes in, she says, Dad, can I have some ice cream? It's 3 o'clock in the afternoon. I say, no. And she says, Mom said I could, right? Which is a total lie. Total lie, right? So she's lying to me, right? Because she's basically saying, you have the power to give me what I want, and you won't do it. But you're obligated, according to your attributes, to deliver. You have money in your pocket, you're obligated to give it to people who don't. You have a car, you're obligated to give people rides. You have a coat, you're obligated to give it to people who don't have a coat. You are obligated by your attributes, but truly what that means is this. God is obligated by his attributes in that everything God does must be loving. But does that mean that God must do every possible loving thing? No. No. I'm not going to buy a new bike. No, we're not having ice cream right now. Sorry, I'm not obligated to do every loving thing because I can. When Jesus Christ came to walk on the earth, who the Bible says is the Son of God, God incarnate and with skin on, not everybody on the planet was healed. Not everything got taken care of. There were some loose ends. He came to do a job. He did it to give us the opportunity to step away from sin and into eternal life with him, which we'll talk about at the end. But what I want you to understand is, be angry at the right thing. Be angry at sin. God didn't do this. And secondly, God is not obligated by his attributes to do every loving thing possible. That's not what a good dad does. It's just not. Some of you are distant from God, not because you're mad, but because you're saying to yourself, this isn't fair. It's not that I'm hurt. And I used to really struggle with this, and I still do. I'm fine, but that guy over there is really struggling. My patients are a great example. They come to me and I think, I'm doing great. My kids are healthy, God. This poor family has these kids with these difficult situations that they're navigating. They don't sleep and they're aggressive and they're getting kicked out of school and we don't know what to do. And I think, that's not fair, God. I was never smart enough to get into Drake. That's not fair, God. It's true, by the way. But it's not fair, right? So many people are smarter than me, right? So what does this mean? Let's go back to the ice cream analogy. So here's my family. Here's my family. I'm not obligated by my attributes to give them everything that they ask for, these little rascals. And Alia's one right in front. Man, she's a rascal. Okay, but let's go back to this example, okay? Because remember, we're talking now about how this isn't fair. Now listen, here's what we want as people, okay? Particularly what we want as Western thinking people. We want a particular flavor of justice, and it's called egalitarian justice, which means everybody gets the same, right? You show up at 8 and you work a whole day, then everybody who showed up at 8 gets the same wage, and the guy who shows up at noon gets this different wage, and that's just what happens, and that's fair, and everybody gets the same amount of ice cream. You want to know what justice feels like in our country and in the world as you see it in the life? If you have kids, give them bowls of ice cream. Give them 3 scoops each, and I challenge you to if this is even possible, to have a child not say, she got more than me. She got more than me. It's almost like you have to have like those scales they use to measure drugs. You know, like measure, look, there's 38 grams in here. Okay, same as everybody else's, right? Kids are trained to defer themselves or to choose egalitarian justice. But when we think about the justice of the Bible, it is not egalitarian. Jesus didn't walk into every town and give everybody the same amount of healing and everyone the same amount of time. He was very strategic. But yet, as we think about what we want and what we construe as fair, we don't want the Bible's justice, which is distributive. And what does that mean? You get what you deserve. You get what you deserve. And this is where it gets really dicey. Because what does the Bible tell us we deserve? Death. Because of sin. Because people made choices. Because we live in this fallen world where kids die and sex slavery happens. Because that's sin. Our bike got stolen because we left it out. We deserve death for that. We deserve no bike. We deserve these things. This is what happens. That's the picture of distributive justice according to the Bible until the end of the story. Distributive justice. No one can stand before a good and loving God and say, I deserve heaven. We've all sinned. Nobody has that claim. So maybe you're staying away from God because you're mad. Maybe you're staying away from God because you're saying, this isn't fair. I want egalitarian justice and not distributive justice. And I've told you that being mad at the right thing is fine. And if you want justice, I have to understand that the only justice in which God operates is distributive justice. It's distributive. You get what you deserve. So if you're asking for justice from God, He's going to give it to you, and it's the distributive kind. That's the only way He operates. But let's talk about the last one and the most important. Some of you are distant, not for these reasons we've discussed, but because you still hurt. You still hurt. And it's at this point that I would love to give you an answer. I would love to say, remember when your dad left? Okay, listen, here's why. Okay, I know this. I know that when they treated you that way, I know that when that thing happened and you were a kid, listen, I know that's fruitful soil and good things are going to grow from this, but I can't promise you it's going to happen in this life. I don't know if you're ever going to see your daughter again. I don't know if your dad's coming back. I don't know if the cancer is going to go away. I don't know. I don't have simple answers for you. And believe me, as a physician, I would like nothing more than to give my families simple answers. I would love to say, this is how it's going to be, and this is where it's going to go, and it's going to be this, and it's all going to be wonderful, and that's going to be the end. I don't have simple answers for you, but I do, friends, have 2 things that are infinitely better. The first of which, as we conclude our time together, is the cross of Jesus Christ. And for those of you outside of the Christian faith or are curious, please understand that the cross of Jesus Christ in the life of a believer means a very specific thing. Do you realize that the cross of Jesus Christ was the instrument to kill what the Christians believe to be their Savior? And that would mean that the Christians celebrate a God, the only God of any world religion, who has suffered. Christianity is the only religion that claims a God who has suffered. And if a God of Christian Bible, of a Christian worldview has suffered, what does that mean about your suffering? What does that mean about your pain? That means that you don't experience it in the context of a God who doesn't understand. Because He does understand. Because He did suffer, just like you. What it means is that He got involved. Jesus Christ, God, the God of the Bible, the all-powerful, all-loving God that we've talked about, got involved in the problem. He came to earth and He died on the cross. And what does that mean in the life of a believer? What is the offer on the table for you tonight? It's simply this. The cross reminds us that when we suffer, we are not alone. I don't know if my family is going to be in my house when I go home. I don't know if I'm going to live to see my daughter graduate high school. There are no guarantees. I do not live in a blissful naivete that bad things aren't going to happen. They are. They will. I know where I live. But because of the cross, I know who goes with me where I go. I know that at the end of every road, and at the end of every struggle, and at the end of all strife, at the end of the day, when the tears have stopped, and the casket is buried, and the music is over, I know that in that moment, I am not alone. And I will tell you, when my patients struggle, what they want to know is that I am with them. That I am with them. No philosophical worldview, no logical, no probabilistic version of evil that attempts to disprove a good, loving God can do anything like that for you. The cross reminds us that we are not alone. Concluding remarks. I don't know the reason for suffering, but I know what it can't be. I don't know why things happen. I've said that. But I know what it can't be. It can't be because God doesn't love you, and it can't be because God doesn't care. If he didn't care, then why did he come down here and get involved in this? If he didn't care, then why the cross? Why the promise of being with us? Christians believe that every step of the way, through ashes or tulips, the Christ, the risen God, is with them, and they are never alone. They are never alone. It's the one thing that no one can take away from me. No one can take away that relationship. The cross gives it to us, but more so, the resurrection. I don't have answers. I don't have answers. All I can tell you is the logical and the probabilistic version of evils don't work. They don't work. They don't disprove anything, okay? And they're meant to be put them in the culture, the attic of culture. They're not helpful to us. But what I do have to offer you in their place is the cross, the promise of Jesus going with you where you go, in your suffering, and lastly, the resurrection. The resurrection reminds the Christian, those of us who espouse a Christian worldview, it reminds us that in the resurrection, that death is not the end. I have patients die. Over 1,000 times, I've sat in rooms and watched a little funeral happen. Or families who thought they had one thing and realized in that moment that the child they thought they had is not the child they have. So there's a little funeral that happens. This has happened over 1,000 times. I've sat in rooms with families and diagnosed an autism spectrum disorder and watched these people weep and watch them cry. And when they leave that room and they go out into the world, what is it that I hope they carry with them? Is it a philosophical worldview? Something that belongs on a shelf? Or as a cross of a God who struggles and suffers and walks with you through your sorrow? And more importantly in this, for these families, is the understanding that not only does God go with you, but death and suffering is not the end. For those of you who don't know, the Bible tells the story of Jesus dying and then raising from the dead. The death says he understands how we suffer. And the raising says this suffering will not define you. It is not the end of a story. So many people are separated from the goodness and love and grace and peace of Jesus Christ in this life by a grammatical error. They think it is pain and suffering, period. But if I have learned anything in my 40 years of living, the cross of Jesus Christ and the resurrection tell me that it is not a period at the end of the sentence of your pain and your struggle and your strife. It is a ... The invitation tonight for you is to choose that. Is to not let these small things block you. This piece of shrapnel that was stuck in your soul from when you were a child. To not let that block you or keep you from these eternal truths. To live in such a way that everything sad becomes untrue. I don't know why, but I do know that someday it will all come back around again. Concluding remarks. The philosophical approach of evil and suffering doesn't work. I don't care what your professors say. I don't care what the theologians say. It doesn't work. And I've shown you it doesn't work. The personal approach to evil and suffering is most importantly summarized by understanding that the cross is God with us in our pain, and the resurrection is the restoration that we long for. The presence of evil and suffering does not disprove the existence of God, and it indeed demonstrates a belief in a good and loving God available for all.